I'm with John Bell, our Global Managing Director for Social at Ogilvy. And John, we've just been discussing a study on advocacy for brands and the opportunities in that. To understand what we mean by true advocacy, let's take a hypothetical example of an Australian woman who is very fond of staying at a certain hotel in Bangkok and writes several positive reviews on TripAdvisor encouraging friends to stay there. Is that person an advocate for the brand? How do we define an advocate in your study?
I think that person could definitely be an advocate for the brand. I think one of the things that we're trying to do and distinguish between is casual advocacy on the one hand, which we see a lot in all of the social network activity we do with our brands. We're sharing content, followers and fans will pass along a link or something like that without any explicit endorsement beyond the passing along of content, all the way to passionate advocacy, which is a thumbs up, a 4-star review, a gushing, claim about the place and how much I love it in whatever forum we have in a social graph. And clearly, there's a world in between too, and we value all of it. And I think what we're seeing is that there's possibly a bigger opportunity, or let's just say an untapped opportunity for brands to get really sharp about identifying who their passionate advocates are, like your friend in that example, and those who are, also positively inclined to the brand, but are not necessarily taking as explicit in action.
Okay, now the study looked across 4 markets: China, Brazil, US, and the UK, and you had some very interesting findings around which countries are the biggest advocates for brands. And China was a very high advocacy market.
That's right.
Correct? Now you define advocacy versus passion as well, and China wasn't as high on the passion score. What is the difference between the two, advocacy versus passion? What do these differences mean for brands?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So it did surprise us that China came up top in terms of volume of advocacy. So there's just the amount of mentions out there about brands was highest in China from the 4 markets. When you looked at the kind of high end of the spectrum in terms of qualitative mentions about passionate advocacy, in this particular study, the U.S. came out higher. So if you kind of look into the data about China, and you start to understand just kind of, I think, the sheer volume by which Chinese are sharing on social media, but not yet with the same kind of emotion or passion that we see in other parts of the world. That doesn't, now that I see the data and have gotten smarter about China from our colleagues here, it actually doesn't surprise me. One of the things that I found interesting is when you look into in the 4 categories we looked at: hotels, skincare, coffee, and we actually see what people are sharing about. In China, it's features first. It's the features of the experience. They care about that more than anything, and then the next thing that they over-index for, interestingly, is advertising. So they're stimulated by the advertising that's in the marketplace, which is not necessarily true of Brazil, where something like cost might come up as to index higher above or beyond advertising. So for us, what that does is that gives us a lot of cues, quite frankly, about what people care most about when they engage with brands.
Right, and to some extent in China, that advertising may give brands certain face or status to the brand, which may be contributing to that. I want to stick on China for a moment, just very relevant to a lot of our viewers in Asia. Understanding true advocates versus fake advocates for brands. And this is a very big issue, particularly in China, where it's easy enough to buy 10,000 fans or to buy a lot of likes. Is there an issue when we look into this for brands and separating out genuine advocates versus fake advocates? Are we comparing against real numbers? If we're looking at our nearest competitors, can we trust the data?
No, excuse me. It's a great point about the phenomena that we attribute to China. It's not just China, but what we kind of do attribute it to China: zombie accounts, and also people paying for people to share about brands. We did look at that in the study. We did filter that out. It may have something to do with the volume of advocacy that we saw overall. We've started a practice now internally inside China. I don't think we've actually come up with a proper name for it, but let's call it forensic listening, which is really about getting the heart of the matter and looking at the fake accounts and looking at the false mentions or the paid-for mentions, and then getting down to what was truly kind of authentically shared by people out there. One of the problems we have with that when we talk about proactive social media marketing is not all brands want to see that, strangely enough. And I think it's because we've built a climate where, we haven't yet achieved the level of sophistication in social media measurement that we aspire to. And a lot of brand marketers, rely on a reach metric combined with an engagement metric.
Right, yeah.
And not an awful lot of good comparisons market to market too. So everyone always just thinks bigger is better.
Yeah.
So even if you're trying to get down to the true matter for a brand marketer, sometimes there's just been inherent resistance to make that number smaller, even if it's more accurate.
And speaking of which, if you're understanding this advocacy measure for the first time, are there any parallels with, say, traditional measure like Net Promoter Score?
Yeah, it's interesting. Net Promoter Score we're a huge fan of, and a lot of the brands we work with use Net Promoter Score overall. The idea that, would you recommend this? A single, simple metric that essentially boils down to an advocacy metric. Now, though, we have the opportunity through social media of detecting people advocating for brands, not answering a survey question. In some ways, it's a little bit more native, if you will.
Right, because it's the actual conversation rather than their reported advocacy.
That's right, and we heard, there was a wonderful quote from Barbara from IHG in our panel about the value they place on positive mentions, and they've distilled it down to a KPI that they value. They know how that will convert into stays. They're in the business of this. Word of mouth was not invented just yesterday for them, and so they've been able to now correlate that to how word of mouth happens online. And I think it's brilliant. I think brands that achieve that kind of clarity around how they value advocacy have an edge over all other brands.
So let's speak about that lastly. Once you understand your advocacy score from this native listening work, what do you do with it? How can a brand then turn this into something very actionable to convert to more sales, room rates, sign-ups, registrations?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we did this study, we didn't really intend to do this, but we created an advocacy index in the process of doing this. So all the data we collected, 7 million mentions across those 4 markets, in the categories we looked at, end up being a valuable benchmarking resource. So we can literally look at that data now and essentially compare different brands in a category. And I'm for people using that as a metric. It's not why we did it, though. I think that the most important outcome from the brand advocacy study we did for brands is really trying to understand more precisely the differences country by country, category by category, and down to your brand. Because the drivers for talk in China for Dove, let's say, or for another skincare brand are different. It's not just the category. And so as you're a brand manager for a particular brand, you want to know what's going to drive people most to talk. Knowing that for Holiday Inn, that most of that they over-index for chatter on the breakfast is important. There's something special about the breakfast.
You mentioned the study that no category is too boring to generate advocacy, which will be reassuring to me given I worked on a very exciting brand of nappy soaker many years ago when my objective was to drive the nappy soaker conversation. It's good to know it's possible.
It is possible. It is possible.
All right, thank you very much for talking with us, John.
Thank you very much.